My name is Neil Chapman. I'm the Forest Health Supervisor with Flagstaff Fire Department and Summit Fire Medical District. Thank you, Karen, for confirming audio is good, so I don't have to be nervous. I'm sitting here in silence. So tonight we're going to talk about the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project. I'm going to kind of run through some background on why we have a wildfire problem. We'll talk a little bit about fire ecology, some solutions at both the landscape and project level, and then we'll get into a few details about some things you can do on your private property as well. We covered some of that in our last presentation, but I always want to refresh people with some of the FireWise tools that we provide to our community. So wildland fire management within Flagstaff Fire Department and the Summit Fire and Medical District. It's been around for over 20 years, and it's really interesting how our community has responded with some innovative ways to address our wildland fire problem. This dates back to the mid-90s. And so right now we have a pretty robust program where Deputy Chief Jerry Bills, who oversees our community risk reduction, is in charge of our wildland fire management team. It includes myself, Paul Ochogies, our wildland fire manager. FireWise specialist is an open position. Geraldine Byrne was there for many years here in town, and she just left us to move to Louisiana to be a pilot full-time. Dylan Guffey is new. He's our crew captain, and Cody Glazner is our crew engineer. Usually we have a bunch of seasonals that we add to a crew as well. But this year we're kind of reorganizing a little bit, and we'll be reassessing how we want to staff that. Our goal is to have more permanent staff and fewer seasonal positions. Wildland fire is a year-round concern for us, not so much a seasonal thing anymore. And we really need to look at how we provide a level of service to our community here year-round, not just seasonally. So our mission, protect Flagstaff and its priority watersheds from the effects of catastrophic wildfire. That's a pretty straightforward mission for our program, but there's lots of different ways we work on that. And so we've got all kinds of partnerships. There's very little we can do on our own. The city does not own the lands at risk that surround us. It's very often the Forest Service that we have to work with. So really it's a big partnership. We can provide capacity, we can provide funding, we can provide ideas, we can provide direction, but we also have to remember that we are not often the ones in charge of the land that we're working on. That's the Forest Service. But we have all kinds of great relationships and agreements that can give us opportunities to collaborate as needed to get the work done. So our problem is the social, economic, and environmental impacts of unnatural, high-severity forest fire. So on the bottom here are two different views of the Schultz fire. On the bottom left is the Schultz fire the day it erupted from Hart Prairie on the other side of the peaks. And on the bottom right is a few weeks later from the flooding impacts that occurred after the fire. So I'm sure everybody here on the call and in the room here knows catastrophic wildfires create undesirable effects both through the fire itself and the flooding impacts and environmental and economic impacts afterwards. In a term that I like to steal from a lot of other folks, fire is local. And so when we talk about good fire and bad fire, that often depends on what sort of landscape we're looking at. And so Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, which is the sister of the Ecological Restoration Institute here in Flagstaff, based at Colorado State University, has put together some wonderful slides. I'd be happy to share this information with folks afterwards if they want to contact me. There's more in-depth information, but we see a couple different habitat types here. You see some sagebrush, PJ, pinyon juniper, ponderosa pine mixed conifer, Doug fir mixed conifer, lodgepole, which we do not have here in Arizona, but we do have subalpine. And so these areas burn differently. Not every fire affects the landscape equally in a natural way. So when we're looking at our ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer, we see a frequent low severity fire regime. When we look at our subalpine environment, like upper elevation on the peaks, the natural fire regime over there that's evolved for thousands of years is a infrequent high severity fire. So as we go up the mountain and it gets colder and wetter, we have less frequent fires in a natural functioning system up there. We're down here in our ponderosa pine, we should be seeing frequent fires that stay on the ground. And so the decline of grass fire really is the key that we're looking at here. This is a section of a piece of ponderosa pine from the Arizona Strip from 1606, showing fire scars every decade or more. This is an old tree that was a piece of an old tree, probably from a stump of a very old tree. And so every one of those little white numbers you see on there is a fire scar. And then you can see where the wood really changed after the era of fire suppression, where it no longer experienced fire. And so just one of these tree samples doesn't really tell us the whole story, but when researchers go out and they collect hundreds, if not thousands of these tree samples, we really can start to correlate that our ponderosa pine forest across a very large area was seeing very frequent fire. And for a single tree to experience fire this often, it could not have been high severity fire, or that tree wouldn't have survived for the next fire. So we see the evidence that tells us we had very frequent, very low severity fires that did not kill adult trees, but just provided ecosystem benefits to the landscape surrounding them. So the grasses are what carried these low intensity surface fires. Those low intensity surface fires would burn up seedlings. So a tree that was maybe only a year or two old would burn up in that fire. And then every decade or so, a tree would survive that fire return interval and survive to be a tall adult tree eventually. But what we see in the forest now, where we sometimes see these carpets of regenerating small pine trees, that is often due to fire suppression as well. Very often our forests nowadays are not burning in regular intervals, even though we're trying to get there. So the regenerating carpet of ponderosa pine trees is a problem as well. Here's another tree cookie that has more dates on there for us to take a look at. I like to include the term fire exclusion to this era as well. And so we were suppressing fires by putting out the natural lightning strikes starting in the late 1800s. It was quite easy for most of the 1900s due to it being more of a wet time in the century there, especially in the first half of the 1900s. So putting out the wildfires was pretty easy. A low intensity grass fire, you don't even necessarily need water. You can just use a shovel and put that thing out, or dig a little line around it. Fire exclusion speaks to the fact that a lot of our fires in this area were started by the indigenous people that lived here. And they did that for all kinds of reasons. I think of it as they understood the benefits of the natural fire, and they took that to their advantage and increased the natural fire. So things like burning to maintain grassy areas, or in some certain areas, oak trees will produce more acorns if they burn, or certain areas, there's shrubs that indigenous cultures would use for making high-end baskets, and some of those shrubs would only produce the right woody material for the basket if they burned frequently. So a lot of cultural burning took place, not just in northern Arizona, but all over the West. I heard a wonderful quote from a woman from Northern California who once said, "It's not just our landscape that's fire adapted, our culture is fire adapted." And she was the one who talked about making those baskets. And if those shrubs were burned just the right way, they would produce wood fibers that allowed them to make baskets that could actually hold water. So it was very important for their culture. So we did not just suppress natural ignitions, we excluded the cultural burning that had been part of this landscape for thousands of years. Okay, so these next slides are kind of a little bit of a sequence here. They are the exact same photos of a ponderosa pine forest. So we've got one starting in 1909, another one in 1948, and you can start to see, due to fire suppression, the trees are all filling in. And then another one here in 1989, a completely different fuel structure for fire to work with. And so on the bottom left there, fire in that landscape stays on the ground and burns through the grasses and shrubs. And then on the right there, fire in that landscape, one more click, climbs up into the trees. So on the bottom left, that's our natural fire adapted system. On the top right, that is our unnatural system that we've created due to fire suppression and exclusion. And that's the result of when fire gets into that forest now. And then here's a very local example. This is Walker Lake. So this is just north of the peaks, kind of the Arizona Trail goes kind of close to this, near Forest Road 418. This is the exact same place, taken a photo taken 100 years apart. So the top photo is around 1876. The bottom one is about 100 years later. And you can see the top one actually has a little grass fire scar in the close part of the photo there, a little water in the cinder cone there. The trees are spaced apart either as individual trees or as groups of trees. So sometimes we'll have trees that group together where their canopies are interlocking. Other times we just have an individual tree in an opening. But that top photo really demonstrates what a frequent fire adapted forest structure looks like, where the bottom one, not so fire adapted. We see some dead trees in there. We see some fire scars. That's not a healthy, resilient forest on the bottom, where the one on the top certainly is. And here we are a little higher elevation. That's Fern Mountain on the top there. And if we zoomed out, the ski resort would be up on that slope. Snowball would be up there, but that top photo is about around 1880. The bottom one is about 1980. So once again, fire suppression, exclusion, and heavy grazing as well completely changed our forest structure and pattern. The way the grazing changed, especially in a place like Hart Prairie, where some of the early cattle and sheep numbers were pretty extraordinary. You know, when a natural fire would start from lightning, the grass would carry it. And if there's no grass to carry it, then we're suppressing the natural ignition just by keeping the cows and the sheep out there. So it's not that at the time we were intentionally doing a lot of this. It's just kind of, you know, to create the nightmare scenario we have now, it wasn't just one management impact. There was a lot of strategies that came together to create the fire scenarios that we're seeing. But, you know, that's quite a change there. So sometimes around Hart Prairie, you'll see the term meadow restoration used. And so it's not just thinning of the forest. There's areas where we're actually restoring the landscape back to the open grassland. And that can be a pretty big change for folks visually. So it's, we try to do as much education with folks and signage as possible. So folks know, you know, like that photo on the top, there's a specific area along 151 where they've been doing the meadow restoration thinning. And it's not that we're out there trying to clear cut the forest for some sort of timber gain. Those trees that grow in the meadow are even lower value than you might think, because they have those branches down to the ground and they're very kind of triangle shaped versus tall. So those big trees that grow in the meadows are even incredibly lower value compared to the regular trees that we're removing from the normal forest thinning. And then here's a photo from 1909 at the top of Bill Williams Mountain. I do not know who that is, but the Williams newspaper shared this a while ago. And you can see, looking back at the peaks, how much of that landscape was grassland and savanna type forest versus what we would see now. I don't have a copy of that photo taken recently, but I'm sure we would see very little grassland left out there other than a few spots around Garland Prairie and in the parks area. But you know, that is just some of the landscape that was here originally that has slowly changed over the last 100 years. So that's our transition of our landscape. So what can we do to reduce these fire effects, both in our landscape and to our communities? Well, we can restore the natural fire adapted structure and pattern. And so that means going in and using either thinning or fire to try to restore that pattern and structure. So the pattern would be the location of the trees across a landscape from a density to a smaller density or lower density, and the structure would be kind of our vertical changes. So instead of having trees that are all just one age in the forest, we try to have trees of many age classes in the forest. So restoring that fire adapted structure and pattern is our ticket. And that's great because we don't need some sort of altered structure and pattern. We just need the natural structure and pattern to protect our communities and keep our forest healthy. So thinning, we can do that with mechanical equipment, meaning logging equipment. And again, we're not out there logging trees because a sawmill is saying, I want these trees. We're designing ecological restoration-based prescriptions and then requesting that the timber industry go in and do that work for us. You can do it with hand crews using chainsaws. And most of that work is all private sector capacity. The Forest Service does not own logging equipment. They do have some capacity with chainsaws and hand crews, but it's minimal compared to the private sector. And when we talk about fire, you can restore some of that structure and pattern using fire, but it's a lot harder and less precise than going in with thinning, where you're actually identifying individual trees to remove and trees to leave. But the goal of the thinning is to set up enabling conditions for fire. And so we can do that work using prescribed fire, or there's something called wildfire that meets forest plan objectives. There's all kinds of terms we could use to describe that, but basically we can have wildfires that do good things on our landscape. If we have the right thinning in place, or we have some fire history that's created a fire adapted structure and pattern, then when a lightning strike occurs, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a bad fire, or if a campfire blows up, it doesn't necessarily mean that the effects of that are going to be catastrophic. And so that's kind of a vision that, you know, if we see smoke in the air, we don't have to assume something catastrophic is happening out there. But our fire management workforce is almost all agency capacity. There is some private sector workforce components out there, but they're almost based entirely in suppression of wildfires. You rarely see contractors doing prescribed fire out west. It's a little more common in the southeast and in some other places, but out west, it's usually the Forest Service or other federal agencies and municipalities that are out doing the prescribed fire. So two very different systems and two different solutions. I like to say we can kind of dangle money in front of loggers and contractors, and they'll follow us. So we can kind of point them in the right direction with thinning by strategically using funding. It doesn't work that way with fire. Our workforce has a whole different system that we have to manage for that. We can't just say we're going to go pay people to do fire. There's much more complicated processes in that. So getting into the specifics of FWPP, thinking back to 2010, the Schultz fire had just happened. We saw flooding coming in afterwards, and our community was desperate for some sort of solution. Some very innovative people at the time, I will admit I was not one of them, started organizing in the community to say, you know, what if we could create some sort of public financing to go out and do ecological thinning in these strategic watersheds around our community, and these strategically placed areas in these watersheds around our community. And they created a ballot initiative. There was a group created to support the initiative of local volunteers in the community. And the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project concept was kind of born in 2012. It all came together very quickly. I think it was around January or February when it was approved to be put on the ballot. And then by November, 74% of the voters had approved this funding. It was a $10 million bonding effort through the city of Flagstaff. Our mayor at the time and our city manager and a lot of our folks like Fire Management Officer Paul Sommerfeld and the volunteer community with Diane Vosick from ERI and Karen Mellis Clark, who was with the Forest Service. It was just this incredible grassroots effort to organize around saying, we know that doing this ecological thinning prevents catastrophic fire and prevents the flooding afterwards. We know where we need to prioritize this work. We know it costs money, but the city of Flagstaff committed to spending that money in these strategic areas. And so it passed in November of 2012. And again, 74% of the voters supported this initial effort. And I just wanted to zoom in a little bit here. So the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, that was the language used in the ballot, included two priority areas: the upper Rio de Flag watershed, which is that one right around the peaks. And within that, the focus was the Dry Lake Hills. And then the other priority watershed is called the Upper Lake Mary or the Walnut Creek watershed. And that includes Mormon Mountain, the north side of Mormon Mountain, and that blue area to the south that protects our or drains into the Upper Lake Mary Reservoir. So those areas were a priority for us due to the economic and social impacts of big fire on the peaks, big fire around the community of Flagstaff itself, and big fire around our surface reservoir. So that Upper Lake Mary watershed can provide between 30 and 40% of the water to the city of Flagstaff. And we did not want to see some of the effects over there that other communities have seen. The Hayman fire, I believe in 2002 in Colorado, burned around a reservoir that created significant impacts to the Denver water supply. And then those steep slopes on Mormon Mountain were a big concern because of what we had seen recently in the Schultz fire. And so making the case economically is not hard for this work. We've seen so many things that cost so much money when we have catastrophic wildfires. And so working with some partners, there was really about 10 metrics of this. And we think about something called the triple bottom line, where we have environmental, social, and financial costs. So we're looking at the actual wildfire suppression and rehabilitation costs, damage to the structures and the contents of those structures. So using, again, the Schultz fire example, there's over an estimated $80+ million in costs from the Schultz fire. Only about 10% or $10 million of that was the actual suppression of the wildfire itself. The rest was effects after the fire. Damage and replacement costs of utilities. So we have water line systems. We have major communications infrastructure on top of the Dry Lake Hills on Mount Eldon there. We have lots of communication devices on top of Mormon Mountain. So if those things go down, it's expensive and costly. We can come up with some numbers that talk about loss of wildlife habitat and the loss of timber value. You know, we're not looking at big timber value coming out of our forest, but there are areas where log trucks might actually be returning a few dollars per truckload to the Forest Service. And at our big scales, that number does become significant. Treatment costs. So if we see treatment needs for our drinking water facilities, that can become very expensive. The wildfire burned soils that end up in water supplies require a big change in how we treat our water. The source water protection itself, we know by preventing those fires at the source. Recreational value is a big ticket item out here. When we close areas due to fire or people don't recreate there anymore, that's an impact. Local income, business revenue, again tied to recreation value, job creation, property value. You know, property value was something early on that was a big concern. The original estimate by the Northern Arizona University and the Schultz fire had about $130 million in costs because people's property values dropped. But we've seen that come back until recently, and we'll see if it drops again with two big fires over there. But when they recently reassessed that economic impact of the Schultz fire, they did see that a majority of the property values had rebounded. And then FWPP itself had, and working with the Rural Policy Institute at NAU, did a cost avoidance study. And this was, I think, completed about a year after the bond was passed. And so we're looking at some pretty spooky numbers here for the Dry Lake Hills. That's why that area was selected first to go after with the bond funding. You know, about $500 to almost $1 billion in costs due to some fires over there. And then Mormon Mountain as well, $84 million to $215 million. So we know that investing in this work up front prevents these impacts later on, not just economic impacts, but social impacts, quality of life impacts. You know, we don't need to be sending firefighters into such dangerous situations. A young girl drowned in a flood event after the Schultz fire. We know these things are preventable. We just need to continue to invest our social capital and our financial capital in doing this work. And that potential flood impact map is pretty telling when we see the 180 corridor can potentially fill up with water and just send the entire downtown area into a flood status. And you know, we've seen some floods downtown without catastrophic fires, but nothing as bad as what we would see if the majority of the peaks on that south face burned up. We've also been working with the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority of Arizona. So when a bond passes, you don't just immediately get a bunch of money. So I believe that one of the first draws of money for FWPP was $4 million. And then just recently, they pulled another $6 million through a loan with the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority of Arizona. And so they are really growing their efforts in this forest health realm. They basically created a loan that had forgivable principal and interest rates that are saving the city of Flagstaff well over $1 million over the term of that loan compared to traditional financing. And then some of the attention from this partnership between the city and WIFA built up into the EPA sending one of their contractors our way to put together a pretty robust report about how investing in these programs where the feds provide funds to the state who then can determine what needs are best for their state to do this sort of partnership. And so we have a pretty impressive brochure. I'm happy to share this with folks if they're interested, but it gets into the nitty gritty about how thinning our forests and restoring these landscapes are good for our economic interests. We just have statistic after statistic showing how the money we put into this, even though sometimes it may be millions of dollars, is saving us potentially billions of dollars. And so when we look at our water supplies, when we look at our revenues, when we look at our tourism-based industries, all of this stuff really ties together. Oh, I'm looking at the comments. Oh, Karen, thanks for your feedback. Let's see. Similarities between post-Schultz fire 2012 2010 to 2012 and the current situation post pipeline fire. Sure. So let's see. Pipeline fire burned up through the Schultz fire scar, and it was a really crazy thing to watch that happen. I was on a Type 3 engine. We were working right behind the community, trying to help control some of the operations over there, and basically couldn't really see the fire the first couple of days because we were kind of in with the smoke and in close. But then on the third or fourth day, after it kind of cleared out a little bit, and we were pulling in, driving down Campbell Avenue one morning over there in Doney Park, you could actually see the mountain, and everything that was either growing back in the Schultz fire scar or the timber that was still there, dead and dying timber, was just vaporized and just gone. It was really amazing how that had burned right through that landscape. And so, although we see some of these the early burned area response maps showing low severity fire in some of these areas, it'll be interesting to see how that results in flood damage, because that fire may not have burned in a long duration. It kind of went through there very quick, but it looks like it got very hot just from some of the soil effects where we were walking around. You know, there's a term moon dust where as you walk, it kind of just blows up. It's like a powder. And so I think that area is going to be in some big risk over time still from this reburn. There was a lot of amazing work that the Forest Service and the county did in there to try to rehabilitate the floodplains. And in one of multiple floodplains, they took logs and buried them in the ground and put rebar around them to try to stabilize the floodplain. And some of those things burned up underground. And so we saw these strips of charred soil. And when we walked into these areas, what is this? Why are there lines? It looked like somebody with a drip torch went in these straight lines, and it was literally the logs burned underground. So hopefully not as much as it looks like, but some of those stabilization features we've lost in the pipeline fire.
Well, we saw, like, I know there were a lot of photos, and like I saw some myself of the big like columns of flame coming off. Like you could see them from down here.
Yep.
So does that indicate that it was very high heat?
So yeah, that was probably the areas that had not burned before that were upper elevation. And so in the pipeline fire, it went and kind of got a few of the acres around the Schultz fire that the Schultz fire didn't get to. So some of those subalpine areas like Weatherford Canyon, and basically the new black areas on the mountain are where those 100-foot flames were coming off those areas. Again, those very upper elevation areas have a less frequent, higher severity natural fire component to them, but I think we'll have to be very hopeful, because in our uncertainty with our climate these days around, do we get snowpack? Do we get monsoons? Is it going to be too hot? Is it going to be too dry? Some of those areas may not regenerate to the same way that they were before. So instead of being a spruce and fir dominated area up that elevation, maybe we get a little more ponderosa pine or white pine or Doug fir kind of coming into some of those spots. So it'll be interesting to see over time how those upper elevation areas return, but it certainly is a slow process up there. We're talking hundreds of years before it'll look something like a forest again in those areas. But the slopes burned very hot again, where the Schultz fire had passed through, and we're going to have to do a lot of work, and as a community come together and support each other, and just pray that we don't get those big dumps right on top of that fire scar for a while. But it could take years. 2 years went by before we got big rain on the museum fire scar, and we still got flooding from that. Yes, thank you, Karen. So a reminder as well, the Schultz fire, that area was proposed for a thinning project. The NEPA process was going through, and that was delayed because at the time thinning was still, I mean, this is back in 2010, which really isn't that long ago, but it does seem like forever sometimes, where at the time there was some objections and some litigation around the project. It was delayed. And then by the time the Forest Service was in a position to put out a contract for that area, I believe it went unbid. Nobody bid on that contract. And so then it didn't get cut. And, it really set the stage, not just for FWPP, but for the Forest Restoration Initiative, which is our landscape level solution. And really that social license of saying we can't put up with additional landscape level litigation and shutdown and delays led to the creation of a 1 million acre project plan, we have 500,000 acre fires. We need 500,000 acre solutions. And so that's where the Forest Restoration Initiative and the FWPP are basically, I think of them as like brother and sister. We're in the same family, we're in the same house. We're not competing with each other. The more successful FWPP is, the more successful FORFRY is. And so when FORFRY helps build an industry, that means for some of these complicated areas within FWPP, we don't have to subsidize it as much because we have more of a functioning industry to do this. So they're very complementary. And I don't have a whole lot of info on FORFRY, but if you guys are interested in any of that, feel free to contact me and I'll try to get some more info. Yeah, they do have a great website. So FWPP accomplishments, very early on, the city jumped on top of some projects at Observatory Mesa. So that's also a big success story, was just the acquisition of those state land parcels by the city to create the Observatory Mesa natural area. And so that all came together and the city was able to quickly jump on top of the FWPP project and start some treatments up there. Partnering with the county, partnering with the Navajo Nation, and it took a little time for the Forest Service because they had to do the planning efforts for the area. But there's also state land sections here in town that they were able to support the treatments on. And so we've completed over 6,000 acres within the FWPP footprint over time. And we've got a few more projects that we're working on as well that I'll tie into here. Originally I think the intent was to try to treat about 10,000 acres. I have bigger visions. And so I think we're looking at a little over 11,000 acres on our list right now, but we're also looking at, the original goal was kind of the Dry Lake Hills and that Mormon Mountain within the watersheds. And I think now we're really we need to look at the whole watershed. And then to some degree, we need to look at the perimeters of the watershed because fires don't stop at watersheds. So we're really looking at over 40,000 acres that really need treatments around these priority watersheds. But we can only add so many acres to our chart at one time before it gets overwhelming. So these other projects right here are the current ones that we're actually in progress on. And so I'll go through a few of these maps. Here's our Observatory Mesa natural area. The majority of the thinning is complete up there, but we're continuing to work on prescribed fire and working with the Forest Service. That parcel right in the middle there of Forest Service land is slated to be treated sometime soon. And then we're also going to start working with Lowell Observatory. There's a section just to the right of section 3 there that Lowell is managing. That's section 17, where they're looking to potentially expand some of their footprint. And in the past, that area was just not treated. But recently talking with the Forest Service and with Lowell, we're going to get in there and work with them and try to get some work done. The railroad fire started in that parcel right there. And luckily it started in a pretty open spot. So firefighters were able to jump on that. And then somebody made the genius idea many years ago to put a fire hydrant right below that fire. So the fire hydrant's literally on the right side of the train tracks over there. I don't know how or why, but it's there. And if the fire hydrant was on the other side of the train tracks, they probably couldn't have used it for this fire, or they would have had to move the hose when a train came by. But it's, all the thinning that's taken place up there has just worked out really well. That was city led through the Wildland Fire Management Program, partnerships with state funding, partnerships with the Nature Conservancy, and doing some really innovative layout work up there using digital prescriptions versus paint. And then recently getting in and doing some burning in those units is just some of the best looking forest we have in town is really right in our backyard right there up at Observatory Mesa. Oh, and then let's see, what did I have next here? We're recording this and I'm happy to share all these maps with you as well. And so when we're looking at some of these new projects within FWPP, I wanted to show this map real quick and kind of zoom in with it a little bit, but this is the Flagstaff Ranger District Mechanical Harvesting Plan. And so it's really impressive to see how many acres they've already got planned out. So that means it's NEPA approved. They're in various stages of what we call layout. So they've either been cruised, we may even have trees painted up there, or they've been marked with alternative methods using digital prescription work. But basically you can see the west side of the peaks there, and everything southwest of Flagstaff and southeast over there as well. We have a really robust process in place to try to get these acres prepped. We're just kind of waiting for the industry to catch up and be able to implement this work at a meaningful pace. And this is zooming in a little bit as well to the west side of Flagstaff, or I mean, the west side of the peaks. The majority of all of these different polygons are within the Upper Rio de Flag watershed. Highway 180 goes right through there. And these are going to be huge for us because a lot of these projects are going to prevent some sort of, steam engine of a wildfire that starts way over on the west side there, just slamming into the wilderness area and coming across Highway 180. So these projects are going to be very crucial for the Upper Rio de Flag area. And so we were in the middle of the Schultz Tank multi-product timber sale when the fire hit. And so that is Schultz Pass Road. You can see 420 right there. This project right here, luckily, was not impacted by wildfire. If fire gets into a timber sale area, they basically have to end the timber sale or reassess it significantly somehow. But once that closure order gets lifted, we'll be able to get back in there. I think it's Dale Lee. They're out of I'm not sure if it's the Prescott or Payson area, but they've been working on that project and doing a great job this summer. That's just near Schultz Tank. And so that's only about a 450 acre project, but it's a real important 450 acres for us. And then the other one that is currently operational, but again, it's all on hold either because of bird restrictions or the fire closure, was the Dry Lake Hills service contract. And so luckily, they had wrapped up most of that unit that's north of the pipeline up there, or north of 420, because the fire did go right through there. And so there's been a handful of cut units that have been implemented north of Schultz Pass Road from the Orion project, this Dry Lake Hills project, a bunch of hand thinning that I have not been up that road yet since the pipeline fire, but the word is that the fire settled down through those treatment areas. I wish we'd had more of them completed, but we should have some examples up there of where the fire slowed down. But when we have, those 50-mile-an-hour winds pushing that fire, even treated areas aren't going to stop it. It'll just slow it down and minimize the impacts. But this project stretches all the way down towards the Schultz Pass Y. It's been awarded to Market Forestry, and so hopefully we'll be able to get back in there and keep working on this later this fall. Oh, let me go back. The purple on that map were the cut units. Yep. And so it's just kind of scattered from like the Weatherford Trail area up top there, all the way back down below. So this is in between some of the units that were cut earlier, either using the helicopter logging or some of the steep slope logging. All of this stuff is just traditional ground-based with like a rubber tired feller buncher. And so, yep, it's all those purple units are the ones that we'll be continuing to work on. And then this one's a big one that we've been putting a lot of effort into getting ready, the Southside Airport project. And so this is almost 2,000 acres of Forest Service projects within city limits. And again, south of town. So any time we're looking at south and west of resources that we have values for, this is a big deal for us because that's the way our winds go during fire season. So the city is working with the Forest Service. We're actually going to fund a couple of water line crossings because part of these cut units involve using roads that cross our city water line from Upper Lake Mary to the water treatment plant. And that's a very old, brittle water line, and we want to make sure nothing happens to it. So we're going to put some city resources through FWPP into that project to make sure we don't drop any cut units because of concerns around water lines. We worked out some nice urban forestry style prescriptions. That kind of horseshoe shaped one there on the left by the airport is a very popular recreation area. There's Ponderosa Trails just north of it. And, rather than following some of our more traditional ecological prescriptions that sort of tell us that was more of a meadow and a grassland over there. It's such a popular area. We're going to use a little more urban forestry technique and leave it a little denser than maybe our traditional forest prescriptions would tell us we should. So we're doing a great job of kind of recognizing the values for that area. It's surrounded by an airport, a highway, and a community that's not prime ecological habitat, but it is prime people habitat. And every time we'd go out there, we saw so many people recreating in that little area, walking, hiking, running around. So we've come up, I think, with some great compromises for that area. Another one in progress is the Mormon Mountain Timber Sale. And so it's kind of that blue color right there. Suarez Forestry is working on that one. That's at the base of Mormon Mountain. It's what we kind of refer to as the head of the duck, because you can kind of imagine a duck there somehow. And then that kind of greener color, the lighter green in some of those areas called Weimer Springs. That's going to be some additional thinning, probably some hand thinning units out there. So we don't need to go and do treatments across all of Mormon Mountain. We've identified some priority areas that are way out of their range of historic variability that we can go in and do that work. The rest of the area, as of right now, we don't have plans for treatment on Mormon Mountain itself. One of our new areas that we're looking at is this what we're calling the LaRue project area. So when we were looking at that map earlier of the Upper Rio de Flag watershed and the Forest Service projects, there's kind of a gap right there. You could think of it as in between Schultz Pass Road and in between Hart Prairie Road. And so that's a pretty important area. If that burns hot, it's going to drain right down into the Fort Valley community and can impact the Upper Rio de Flag watershed quite a bit. So we're just starting to kind of hike around out there and start to identify some areas that either have to be worked on as designated steep slope acres. We're looking at where traditional ground-based mechanical acres exist, because sometimes you can look at, you can just look at topo lines on a map, but then you walk out there and it's a giant boulder field of rocks. And so you've got to identify where we can get in. And then Snowball Road is surrounded by a bunch of really sensitive Mexican spotted owl packs. Protected areas for spotted owls. And so we're trying to prioritize how we can do a bunch of work out there without impacting the spotted owl areas. Not that we can't do anything in spotted owl areas, but we just have to be a lot more strategic about those acres compared to the areas outside of those protected spots. And we're working with the Fort Valley Experimental Forest. So that's kind of a unique management unit outside of the Coconino National Forest. It's part of the Rocky Mountain Research Station, or not managed directly by the Coconino itself. But there's some really important acres right there for the folks that live in the Summit Fire District within the Fort Valley Baderville area. And so we originally reached out to them and talked about kind of that hash marked area where it's got a gray box around it. We've worked with a lot of the homeowners right through that area and got some good thinning done on their property. But then on the other side of the fence, the forest looks pretty bad. And so we went to the experimental forest folks and said, can you guys come out with us and take a look at this? Because the homeowners are doing their part right there and doing some fuel reductions. But your side of the fence is in rough shape. And they said, wow, this looks pretty bad. And so originally we looked at just thinning a small area, but then the folks over there realized the need to try to do some ecological management on a larger area. So we're looking at potentially 200 acres of thinning within the experimental forest right there. And that would be great just to protect all the research that's taking place out there so it doesn't burn up in a bad wildfire, and also reduce risks for quite a few homes that border along that area right there. And it would also add to the list of accomplishments, working with an experimental forest. And the managers over there are very supportive. It's just a little more complicated than working with the Coconino all by itself. And so we hope to have some good lessons learned on how to add an experimental forest to our partnership. A little bit of history, the experimental forest right there is the first experimental forest ever created in the country. So the early loggers in the northern Arizona area, even in the late 1800s, were noticing how slow our trees are growing in the area. And we're concerned about what is our sustainable management for our landscape. And so I believe the Reardons were friends with Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service, and asked him to try to do something about this. And so Gifford Pinchot talked to his friend, Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the time, and they created the experimental forest, I believe in 1908. And so it was the first in the country. It's an amazing piece of history right there for us all. Well, was I right? Was that okay? Good, thank you. And it's kind of I feel like to some degree, a little bit of an unknown gem in our community out here that we have that piece of history in our area.
Could you talk more about what they do with these? What makes it an experimental forest?
Experimental forest, I think, means that in the early 1900s, they set up a bunch of study plots. And so they were monitoring how trees were growing. Sometimes if you drive up Highway 180, you'll see those kind of black buckets, and those are collecting pine needles, and they were monitoring how pine trees are shedding their pine needles. So there's all these research projects that took place out there. So we have these study plots going back to 1908 that we can tell how our forest has changed over time. There's also one of my favorite little spots as you drive up 180 on your left before you get to where the old buildings were. There's some old wooden posts in the ground, and they're kind of scattered amongst an area. But that was apparently some kind of fence post study where they had different types of wood with different types of treatment to study which ones lasted the longest. And I don't know if anybody's still monitoring that to see which ones are still there compared to the others, but it's always fun to drive by there and kind of see that fence post project left out there. So it's not just this little part right here. It does stretch down past east of Snowball Road, almost all the way back down to the Chimney Springs area within the Coconino. So it has a pretty big footprint, and it really has some amazing research history inside there. Oh, one more comment, let's see. Managed by the research branch of the U.S. Forest Service, the largest forest science organization in the world. Oh, thank you. That's great. Okay, so what's our next one? Let's see. We're also working inside Picture Canyon. So this one is another city-owned gem. That place was purchased a few years ago, again, off of a state land deal through city funding. And you can see that red area is our project. It's pretty dense in some of those spots in an unnatural way. But because of the archaeological values out there, we're not getting in there with heavy equipment. It's just hand crews going in with chainsaws. We've been doing most of that work with city wildland crew, but we're looking at working with either the American Conservation Experience or Arizona Conservation Corps. We've been able to get some good trainings in that area. We also hired a local archaeological firm. SWCA has their archaeologists working with us to identify strategic areas to place our slash piles that won't impact any artifacts. There's a bunch of cultural resources out there. And so we have these shapes on a map where we're not supposed to build slash piles without approval from an archaeologist, because then if we don't want to build piles on a sensitive site and then burn them and lose those artifacts or damage them underneath the pile. So it's not the most traditional operation out there, but it's one we're very proud of, that we're able to get that work done without damaging the artifacts out there. And I think of the 200-acre area, we're a little over halfway through. And again, that one was partially funded through a grant with the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. And then a new program we just started last year was something called a Prescribed Fire Training Exchange. And so this wasn't just in the FWPP footprint, but it's basically growing out of the concept of all the partnerships that were created through FWPP. And so a Prescribed Fire Training Exchange was originally started by the Nature Conservancy, and they are now growing it out so other partners are able to kind of run their own exchanges. And so these are opportunities where we organize and provide experiential training that builds local capacity for fire management. And so our Flagstaff Training Exchange last year was targeting municipal fire departments that want to learn more about prescribed fire. So we received funding from the International Association of Fire Chiefs and the Nature Conservancy, and we funded about a dozen folks that came to Flagstaff, and we paid for their meals and their lodging, and we spent 2 weeks either burning or learning together. And so it's basically run like a small little incident, and everybody has a role to play. We have planning operations taking place, and so we prepped some units up at Observatory Mesa, and got about, I think, 300 acres burned up there. We burned about 800 acres of Forest Service land as well on a couple different units. And we had tours up at the Grand Canyon to learn about how fire is a natural process in the park from Jason Nez, who's just an amazing person up there. He's a resource advisor, an archaeologist who specializes in fire. And we learned about how we can use fire to protect cultural resources, not protect cultural resources from fire. And experts from NAU and the Ecological Restoration Institute talked about fire history and fire effects. We had folks from the Forest Service talk about some of the lessons learned from the slide fire from 2014 and how years of prep work down in Oak Creek Canyon really protected that community. And then when the fire got up on the rim, how years of treatments up top really prevented catastrophic effects over there. So these prescribed fire training exchanges really are amazing opportunities to really help build what I call the fire lighting workforce. We have a strong suppression workforce of firefighters, but we really need to keep building our fire lighting workforce. And this is people who are trained and skilled in the ability to light and manage fires. And especially after some of the incidents we've been seeing where, unfortunately, in New Mexico, a prescribed fire that transitioned into a big wildfire. Not that there's, I don't know all the details around how all of that happened, but we're never going to run out of training opportunities and training needs for us to really develop our skills in this department. 99.4% of prescribed fires do exactly as they're designed to do, and less than 1% of wildfire or prescribed fires that are declared wildfires ever damage any property. So it's an incredibly well-managed and low-risk environment, but at the same time, we want to identify those risks and those challenges and constantly improve our business practices. Another initiative that has grown through our wildland fire management program is our clean air initiative. And so we're working closely with our sustainability division on this. And, we know that doing prescribed fires and good fire management still puts some smoke in the air. It's a lot less impactful and a lot less dense than wildfire. That's catastrophic wildfire smoke. But we know that there are people in our community that have legitimate health impacts or do not live in homes that are as well insulated. And so we have received funding over the last couple of years to buy a bunch of air purifiers. And so these are just like in the picture there. It's a standalone unit about the size of, like a small recycling bin. And we received, I think, $15,000 last year. Currently, I think we have about $5,000 this year to buy some more of these and give them out. I would love to get truckloads of these things somehow. We're trying to figure it out how to do that. And basically you just plug them in and turn them on, and they're designed literally to remove the particles that are exactly what prescribed fire and wildfire smoke are from your in-home air. If you have a very fancy HVAC system or air conditioning in your house, you can put a HEPA rated filter in that system. If you have one that only takes about a 1-inch size filter, the HEPA rated filters are a lot less effective, just because for that dense of a filter to operate in a 1-inch space, it puts a lot more stress on your venting system of like the blower motor. But we at our house, we only have that 1-inch filter. We don't have air conditioning, but we have one that if the air gets bad, we'll slide that thing in for a couple hours and run it. And then we could take it out and put the other one back in for over the winter with a gas heater. So there are ways you can use your existing gas heater if you have one, or gas blower or air conditioning system to do this. But a lot of folks in Flagstaff don't have air conditioning systems. A lot of our older homes are maybe not as sealed up as well as some of the newer ones. So these air purifiers really are a great tool. We're also looking at city buildings, for example, the library. We could be retrofitting the HVAC systems, the entranceways, the windows, and everything to turn these into what we would call a clean air hub. So let's say just plugging in an air purifier into your house really isn't an option for you, that you literally need to get into a building that's almost got an HVAC system like a hospital. We can work on finding ways to fund and do this work for city buildings, to think of our community not just as a fire adapted community, but a smoke adapted community. So what kind of resources are we going after to help our community with the smoke impacts? This is it right here. So truckloads of air purifiers that you can plug in your house, retrofitting city buildings. I think there's advantages even looking at something like Northern Arizona University could be looking into their dorms and saying our dorms could be probably a more smoke adapted system, or our classrooms are, their systems over there, I think we could really look at our entire community when we're thinking about this. So the city of Flagstaff fired us, basically me and the fire team, and Nicole Antonopoulos and her team with the sustainability division. And then of course, in conversation with our facilities folks and trying to look at our city buildings and future buildings and existing buildings. And then there's federal programs that we're starting to explore on how they make grants. There's Building Resilience in Community, or BRIC grants through FEMA, that we're starting to try to figure out how we could put something big together, but then we got to come up with some matching funds for those. But we've received some gifts, both from typical foundations that give money to the municipalities, but we've also had some private foundations give donations to buy these things as well. So I think it'll be a public-private partnership that probably gets us where we need to go.
Could you talk about where people can go to do this now, or if they can do it?
Yes, contact me directly. We still have a few left. I've got $3,000 of them I need to purchase sometime soon. And so if people have interest in this, let me know. We've got a website up where we set up an application form. And so that just included basic, questions about sort of what are your health impacts at your home. It's not something where we're asking for doctor's notes or verification of income or anything. It's on the honor system. But yeah, we've got a website set up, and just feel free to contact me through this, and we can get you set up with our application. And I'll give you my card afterwards. And so, and again, we're talking all about what we can do in the forest, and then we're talking a little bit about what we can do inside your home. But here's some tools for homeowners thinking about what they can do just directly outside their home. So this is from the National Fire Protection Association. They are the ones that basically manage the FireWise USA program. So if you're looking at your home itself, you can kind of think of 3 zones: the intermediate zone, which is 0 to 5 feet. And we really recommend as little flammable fuel as possible within that zone. Some people like to call it the fuel-free 5. So really thinking about, do you have trees dropping pine needles in that area? Do you have high grasses or shrubs? Is your deck made out of material that's flammable? Where do you store your wood pile? Stuff like that. I know it's always tough in the winter. I joke, I want my wood pile where I can access it in my slippers. But it's really important to think about how we manage that 0 to 5 foot zone. And then we move out a little bit to the intermediate zone. And so that's okay to have some trees in that area or some shrubs, but we also want to talk about making sure that we don't have continuous fuels in that intermediate zone. So you don't want a super dense stand of trees in that 5 to 30 feet. Again, you want to think about your flammable materials, whether it's your wood pile, if you have a shed, is it flammable material? And then when you get into that extended zone beyond 30 feet, you really can worry a little bit less about direct flames coming from that stuff into your house. And you can have a little more density of trees. You could have, like there's an example of a wooden children's playground right there. One of the things we'd like to try to do is take our hazardous fuel grants, where we go in and we can provide support to our community through funding anywhere between 70 and 90% of the thinning needs on your property. I'd like to see that evolve over time, where we can provide matching funds to do things like replace roofs, replace decks with more fire resistant material, and really thinking about not just the vegetation around the community, but the home itself. So the term home hardening is a big thing these days. Some of the recent examples of the Marshall Fire in Colorado, where over 1,000 homes burned from a grass fire. In December. That was 100-mile-an-hour wind and home construction materials that were not FireWise. The tunnel fire, being out there and seeing those 30 homes burn in a short time period over there, that wasn't because of a healthy or unhealthy forest. That was, again, a wildland urban interface of vegetation inside a community burning up the homes in the community. Some of the areas in the forest that the fire started in weren't in the best shape, but that really only impacted a small part of the community right there. And then as it started racing right through that neighborhood, it wasn't, a tree density issue. It was a construction issue and vegetation on the property issue. And so as we're thinking about the millions of dollars that are going into both public and private costs for the 30 homes that burned up in the tunnel fire, we probably could have done a better job spending that money to help people alter the construction of their homes in a more fire tolerant way. In California, there's a state and federal partnership emerging in Southern California, where they're providing up to $40,000 per homeowners in strategic areas to try to help them retrofit their homes. It's tough to say that, we want to tell people what to do with their house, but I think providing financial incentives to do certain things, the cost of the dumpsters and the property value and all the impact and I mean, just the social capital and the money that the county is having to spend in dealing with those 30 homes that burned up, the hazardous material going to the landfill, the sorting of all that material. I guarantee that's more than $40,000 per house of the ones that burned down over there. And then, thank you. And then This is a big one. If you Google ember awareness, you can find this checklist. Again, where it's here in the presentation. Contact me, I can get it to you. But the fire could be a mile away and raining embers down on your house, and a planter on your porch that catches on fire could burn down your house. So ember awareness is a big ticket item as well for us, even if you live in the middle of a neighborhood that doesn't have a bunch of trees in it. So really thinking about all these different ways that an ember could impact your home. Again, a single ember. There's amazing videos out there. An ember lands into a pot that had some flowers and some mulch next to a house, directly up against the house. That little planter catches on fire, and then that window frame that's wooden, even though it was a stucco house, that wooden window frame catches on fire, and then that sent fire up onto the roof. It was a metal roof, but again, there's wood underneath that metal overhang right there sticking out, and then that caught on fire, and then there's fire in the attic, and then the house burns down from an ember landing in a planter. So again, that 0 to 5 foot range, we try to tell people it doesn't mean you can't have planters around your house, but can you move those planters, or do you need somebody to help you? For example, if embers start coming down in your house and you need 10 minutes to pull flammable stuff away from your house, that's completely acceptable. If your patio furniture is plastic, just throw that stuff away from your house if a fire is coming near. So it doesn't mean you have to, live in some sort of sterile environment. You just have to think, how much risk am I willing to take? Can I move these things myself, or do I need help doing it? And so contact us at the fire department if you have questions about grants. We have funds available right now. We've got 2 different grants we're trying to work on where we can help. They come from the state, where we can help homeowners reduce hazardous fuels on their property. Now, this isn't, like a hazard tree removal program where somebody has a crooked tree hanging over their roof. That's really not the point of this program. It's to say, well, if you've got even if it's just a half-acre parcel and you've got some tree density on there that folks want to work with removing, we can do an assessment, see if you're eligible for the program. The homeowner goes out and gets some estimates, and then when they complete that project, we can provide some reimbursement funds. Were there questions in the chat?
No.
No. Oh, thank you, Karen. So really, this is a great program, and it's ramping up. The city's been working on this for years. We've pushed through well over $1 million in the last 10 years of these grants, and we're working with the Greater Flagstaff Forest Partnership in Coconino County to really scale this up. Through the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, there's a new program getting created at the federal level. Right now, these grants, I think, were capped at $250,000. That cap is now going to be $10 million. And so working with our partners at the county to try to figure out how we come up with matching funds and have a Coconino County-wide hazardous fuel reduction grant program for private property, working closely with our fire districts and really getting into some of those areas that need this help. Munns Park, Kachina Village, Mountain Air, there's a lot of areas out there across the county that could take advantage of a program like this. So what I really like to think about what we do on a daily basis is we're trying to turn $1 billion challenge into healthy forests, safe communities, and good jobs. And so the Flagstaff community's original $10 million investment in FWPP is exceeding over $30 million in additional funds. So for every dollar our community contributed, we're bringing in, as of now, over $3 in partner funding. We're working with the Forest Service. As things grow, we're looking at, another potential $10 million influx of funds. So we're looking at huge partnerships that have been leveraged by the original commitment by the city of Flagstaff. And what's really unique about that was the city deciding to tax itself to do work on federal land. And that commitment has grown, where now when the Forest Service is looking at where are these high priority partnerships where they can get the best bang for their buck on their investments, they're looking at our community here. So it's really been an incredibly successful program. So that's all I had for slides. Happy to answer any questions I can and talk about anything related to the recent fires if folks have questions.
So how much of the original treatment area in the project affected by the pipeline fire?
So pipeline fire snuck into a little bit of the upper Rio de Flag watershed. I'm not sure exactly how many acres. I think it was something, just from my regular a Venza map, poking at dots with my finger and trying to estimate some acres. It was possibly a couple thousand acres out of, the upper area being well over 30,000 acres. So it wasn't a huge percentage of the watershed, but it was up on some of those steep slopes and it got hot. So some of the higher, now where it started is low severity, but as it got some steam going in that first hour of the fire, you can kind of see on the fire map, there's that kind of point it started and then it went up. That and when we look up it now, you can see some of the new black on the mountain in that area. So luckily it didn't hit much of the priority watershed for us, but I mean, to some degree, our priority watershed is the whole mountain because Doney Park is Flagstaff too. And so that area, really took a hit. The additional acres for that, I think it's basically it drains eventually into the Little Colorado over there, but we still have some work to do over there. We identified some acres just looking at what's left after the tunnel and pipeline fire abutting the community. So we're talking to the Forest Service. There's kind of a south of the private land, west of 89. There's an area that we want to go look at and see if we can, even if it's just some hand crew treatments, get in there quick and try to reduce fire risk because they really can't take more over there. So it's not as much impact on the Rio de Flag watershed, but big impact to the east side.
Could you talk more about why the flooding last year was so bad or seemed so bad?
Yep. So we had 3 different watersheds flood last year here in Flagstaff. Only one of them was impacted by the museum fire. We had some really crazy rain events, and I hope it's not. I hope it's more of an incident and less of a trend. But unfortunately, I think some of the predictions of climate change showing maybe we have the same amount of monsoon activity, but we have higher intensity, shorter duration events. I think in the 15 years I've been here, I've seen that sort of trending that way. And so the floods last summer, the first big one we did have was right on top of the museum fire scar. I mean, just right on top of it, multiple inches of rain in short duration. And that just came right down through those flood channels right there. Now that area, that Spruce Wash watershed, does have all kinds of geologic evidence of sediment flows over thousands of years. So that area clearly had flooded events over time, well beyond that, Flagstaff has been here. But that fire really was so unfortunate because it was not a whole lot of high severity fire, but a lot of high severity fire in a tiny area, and a tiny area that funnels into one tiny little watershed. And so it really was just as bad as we could get in a place and timing, that we had hot fire on steep slopes directly above a community that funnels down into a bottleneck right there. And then we had a big rain event right on top of it. Then we had another big rain event at the base of Mount Eldon over to the east. And that's,
Is that the Fanning?
yeah, the Steves and Fanning kind of stuff. And that's where the floating Prius video came from. And that had nothing to do with the museum fire.
Right.
That again was like 4 inches of rain fell over there in like an hour.
That was more.
I don't remember.
Localized, or was it?
It was almost all just right there. It was almost in city limits, like right over the neighborhood at the base of Mount Eldon. And then we had another big rain event on the Chimney Springs area west of the peak. So kind of like north of the Cheshire gas station back there, where again, short duration, high intensity rain event. And that's what then flooded out I forget the name of the neighborhood, Forest Hills maybe, or something right there. And then the water came across Highway 180 over top of that culvert right there. And so again, that wasn't museum fire, but it was this freak, high intensity, short duration rain event. And so, it's a little frustrating because I feel like the museum fire scar and that Spruce Wash watershed gets all the attention when I feel like we're seeing flooding in other areas that need attention as well. But that is obviously the one that's most impacted. That's a big concern for everybody. But I think we need, as a community, to really be looking at all our watersheds right now and identifying, where are these at-risk areas and trying to figure out not just the Spruce Wash, but these other areas. What should we be doing? Do we have any more questions?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. The city and the county have, if folks are interested, they can email me. There's a monsoon alert system. There's a website where you can see these individual rain gauges that are all over the peaks in the Dry Lake Hills.
Can you just bring that up on the screen?
I don't have it, and I don't know how to find it. I have a bookmark on my computer. Is it on the city website?
City and county both have, are the gauges.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you can sign up on that website to get alerts. You can also track those storms and basically see, where in 15 minutes, we're in 30 minutes, we're over the last hour.
I was on it this weekend,
Yep,
the storm this weekend, just watching,
yep.
refresh the screen.
And then it bumps up and it's, oh no. And then, it's really impressive, I think, that the folks in stormwater for the city and the county's flood control district, I mean, the cooperation, the knowledge, we're in a huge risk here, even in these areas that haven't burned. Our town is at the base of a mountain, and that mountain likes to get rained on. And so the fires make it worse, but I think that the community efforts from the city and the county for the stormwater work and the partnerships they've built are very impressive.
And to have some of the engineering firms who were around for the Schultz.
Yep.
Who've all grown up together through that.
Yep.
Makes me feel better about managing the rest.
Yep.
You still may get slammed, but got some of the best minds.
Yep. J.E. Fuller has done some amazing flood modeling for everybody. I can't imagine there's any other folks that unfortunately have as much experience. But fortunately, they are really committed to our community here and are doing great work.
Okay, awesome. Cool. I'm just gonna, if you could say bye to the folks on.
Okay, thanks for showing up online. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Karen, as well, for helping facilitate.